Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. Here at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, we talk about all the different kinds of fuel that you may use both at work or at home, and we also talk about all of the factors and problems and considerations that go into using the things that use that fuel, whether at work or at home. And so that means the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for everyone. So what are we going to talk about in today's episode? Well, we are now about 2 months on from the March 26th disaster that was the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. And so we figured it was time to give an update about what's been going on with the aftermath of that. How are things coming with removing the wreckage? Are they ahead of schedule in getting that essential port reopened? And what does the preliminary report from the NTSB say about what they think the cause of the disaster was, if any of those reports have even been released? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so to see where we're at right now, it is helpful to understand where we came from in the situation immediately after the events. Now, with the collapse of the Key Bridge, access to the entire Port of Baltimore was blocked for just about all ships, all except for one small part, what they call the Trade Point Atlantic Marine Terminal, which actually was able to stay open to help process a fraction of the car and truck imports that normally come through the port. Now, immediately after the bridge collapse, there were 40 ships that were trapped in the port that were scheduled to be on their way out, but now couldn't get out. And then there were also 30 ships that were on the water en route with the Port of Baltimore as a destination that they now had to figure out how to reroute those. And not only is there all that to be resolved, they've also got one heck of a salvage operation on their hands. The bridge that collapsed, that all has to be removed, along with all the submerged wreckage from both that bridge and also the cargo from the ship that was knocked off when the bridge fell on the ship. So it's a pretty massive operation that requires massive resources, both financial and professional. So how are they going to do it? Well, first thing, the Army Corps of Engineers takes the lead for removing the bridge. The Navy brings in heavy lift cranes, including the largest crane ship on the East Coast, a ship called the Chesapeake 1000, which can lift 900 tons at a time, and apparently that's a lot. So they brought all those in. You had almost 1,200 engineering specialists, Army Corps personnel, Navy contractors, all deployed to the scene, and they're joined by what you would call a flotilla of 7 floating cranes, 10 tugboats, 9 barges, 8 salvage vessels, and 5 additional Coast Guard boats, along with a partridge in a pear tree, all deployed around the bridge to get the job done. Well, except for the partridge, it doesn't really have anything to do. So anyway, the bridge collapse happened on March 26th. By March 30th, all of those resources are deployed and in place, and they've started the work of removing the first pieces of the bridge. Now, in order to do that, they've got to open a temporary passage so that commercial work vessels can go in and out and use that as something in their recovery efforts. And this passage is about 250 feet wide. It has 100 feet of vertical clearance, and it has a controlling depth underwater of 11 feet. So they've opened this passage. And one of the things that the Coast Guard is going to do, one of the roles that the Coast Guard is going to function in, is they're going to be in charge of approving what ships are going to get to use that temporary passage, because we don't want more disaster piled on top of things. So the Coast Guard is in charge of making that determination there. So this first temporary passage opens on April the 1st. And so even the very next day, they've got barges coming through that temporary passage. 2 days later, on April the 3rd, they get a second channel open, and they start work on a third, and then eventually they're going to have a fourth passage open. And all this time, they're picking up and they're removing pieces of that collapsed bridge. Now, on April 7th, so we're about almost 2 weeks out, they start to remove some of those shipping containers that are still, not the ones that are underwater, but the ones that are still on that container ship, the MV Dolly. And it takes them about 2 more weeks until April 19th, not for them to get everything off the ship, but rather they're trying to remove enough of those containers from the ship itself that they can create a staging area to help them start removing the steel and the concrete that had fallen on the ship's deck itself. So go 1 more week, fast forward 1 more week beyond that, from April 19th to now April 26th. Now, to this point, April 26th, they have removed 3,000 tons of wreckage from the river. That's great, but they've got 45,000 tons still left to go. And by now, that flotilla of search and recovery vessels that we talked about, that's been growing. They've been continually adding to it. Now you've got 36 barges, 27 tugboats, 22 cranes, 10 excavators, 1 dredger, 1 skimmer, and 3 Coast Guard cutters. And they've got more than 550 contractors just on the job, just handling dive, crane, and vessel operations. So that's a lot of stuff that they've got coordinated to try and attack this huge situation. So what's the fruits of all this work, you may ask? Well, as the work situation progresses, sometime in April, the Baltimore Port Administration thought that they would have cleared out enough stuff to be able to refloat and remove the ship, the MV Dolly, they gave a date of May the 10th. Now, they didn't quite meet that goal, but May the 20th was the day that the ship was finally refloated and moved away. So the ship is now out of there. So that's a big deal. And getting all of this stuff out is necessary because they're trying to reopen the port as soon as possible. And they've slowly been able to work towards that goal bit by bit. Now, when all this first went down, no pun intended, March the 26th, they initially thought that the port would be completely closed for months. But it wasn't long before they were able to dial back that prediction from months to weeks. Okay, weeks are better than months. So that was good. And still, each day that passed and each day that continues to pass with the port unable to be used in the way it normally is, that costs money on the tune of about $15 million per day. They want to get that port back open and get things back to business as soon as humanly possible. And slowly and incrementally, they have been working towards that goal. So, again, disaster happens on March 26th. By April the 20th, about 3.5 weeks later, they've got 3 temporary channels open that are allowing about 15% of the shipping volume to pass through. And then they open a 4th channel a week later. And this 4th channel is unique because it's the first, what they call a deep draft channel, which means it's the first one that has the width and, very importantly, the depth to handle the large ships that tended to use the port. However, that one only stayed open for about 9 days because they figured out that if they had that deep draft channel open, they couldn't actually remove the bridge wreckage while it was open. So they had to close it down. So that's what's been going on with the salvage efforts for this. Now, let's talk about some other things. What about these effects on the supply chain? You know, the longer that they have significant parts of shipping channels down, the longer the disruption of the supply chain continues, right? Right. That's not a trick question. Right. The effects of this kind of closure, when you're talking about the shutdown and the severe restriction of one of the country's most important East Coast ports, those effects are fully expected to ripple all throughout the national supply chain, costing people money up and down the chain, right? Dun & Bradstreet estimated that it was going to cost about $1.7 billion per week in supply chain interruptions all down the line when you add everything up. Now, when everything went down in Baltimore, remember we said that there were ships already on their way to the port, and there were ships that were in the port that had not already left. So all of those shipping lines that had ships en route to Baltimore, they have to find alternate ports for those to go. And then the 40 ships of cargo that are trapped in the port, they've got to get that cargo unloaded from those ships, and then they have to figure out routes to ship that cargo over land to where it's supposed to go. And they have to get all that stuff out of the port because they cannot leave it in the port. Even if the port is closed under a situation like this, if they don't get the stuff out of there, there are what they call demurrage and storage and late fees that are going to be accruing. And again, it does not matter that it's all because somebody struck a bridge and blocked the port. They have to get that kind of stuff out of there. And so that's what they were doing. So 4 of the major shipping lines that had some of those ships on their way to Baltimore, they had to reroute cargo to places like to ports in New York and New Jersey. Those were the 2 closest ones that they were able to do that for. Now, what those 4 major shipping lines did is they ended up declaring force majeure to allow them to terminate the contracts of carriage. Now, what that means, that doesn't mean that the cargo wasn't going to get to its final destination. Force majeure in this context just means that they're no longer bound by the original time stipulations of the shipping agreements. And this force majeure is a relatively common element of many types of business contracts. And this is the type of situation where you would expect that clause to come into effect, and so that's what they did. Now, speaking of contracts and agreements, one thing we really haven't talked about that much are all of the insurance ramifications that went down from this situation. Now, in this kind of situation, there are insurance policies and insurance coverages that kick in all up and down the line at all different areas of the chain there. And there's more than enough liability out there with this situation for all of those players involved to bear some of the financial weight. So first, insurance losses. Insurance losses coming from the value of the cargo, like all that cargo that went overboard, right? And also the value of the ship. Now, a number of agencies who know about this kind of thing, like Barclays, Morningstar, they were throwing out estimates that when it's all said and done, anywhere from between $1 billion to $4 billion in insured losses were going to end up coming out of this. Now, I know, that's a wide range. $1 billion to $4 billion is a range of $3 billion, right? But still, that's billion with a B. That's a lot of money. So they don't know exactly how much it's going to end up being. But when they compile that final tally, it's not going to take much going into that range in order to make this situation the largest marine insurance loss in history. And then you've got the wrongful death liabilities. 6 workers that were on the bridge lost their lives. Somebody's going to face legal action and liability over that, as they probably should. And they estimate that when it's all said and done, the settlements there are going to be anywhere from $350 to $700 million when you add all those up. And then we haven't even talked about insurance for the bridge itself. Now, the state of Maryland did have insurance on the bridge. They had insurance for the bridge of up to $350 million is the figure that I heard. Now, that may seem like a lot considering when the bridge was built back in 1977, it cost $60 million. So $350 million. Okay, seems like a good coverage. And yet, you're not rebuilding the Francis Scott Key Bridge for $350 million. It's going to cost a whole lot more than that. And so somebody else is going to have to end up chipping in. Now, let's talk about that for a minute. In the initial first days after the disaster, at the end of March, one of the very first things that the Biden administration did on the federal government level was they committed to help fund that bridge replacement. The Biden administration sent an initial $60 million in emergency aid, And everyone at that time was talking about how it was the federal government's responsibility to absorb the cost of the bridge repair. And by everyone, when we say everyone was talking about this, we mean Democrat and Republican. Everyone agreed on this. Now, in case you haven't noticed the times that we're living in, Republicans and Democrats don't exactly get along. And so what you ended up having happen is you had this group, the House Freedom Caucus, which is a group of Republicans in the House of Representatives headed by Jim Jordan. You may have heard of that guy. And they came out and said that, yeah, they would support funding, or rather they wouldn't oppose funding for a replacement bridge if certain conditions were met. Well, what are those conditions? Do they get free Slurpees or something? No, certain conditions. And there were multiple ones. The couple that stood out was first, whatever funding was given for the bridge, it had to be offset by budget cuts in other areas. Okay, devil's in the details there. They also said the Biden administration had to lift this pause that the administration has on liquefied natural gas exports. Personally, I'm not exactly sure why that mattered in this case. I'm sure there's somebody out there who can speak exactly to it, but that was one of the things that the House Freedom Caucus said. Now, to this point in time, it doesn't actually appear that the House Freedom Caucus, what they had to say really mattered in any of this. It doesn't appear that their role in the funding made a difference, or them voicing their opposition or support for the funding. It doesn't appear that that really played a role in any meaningful way. Okay. But what does seem to matter, if it's not the support of the Republican House Freedom Caucus, what does actually make a difference and will actually make a difference is if they can get this bridge project qualified for what they call a categorical exclusion under the National Environmental Policy Act. Now, if they can get this categorical exclusion applied to this bridge project, it would accelerate considerably any applicable regulatory reviews, and it would dramatically shorten the timeline for the bridge building. And this isn't an insignificant thing that we're talking about. I mean, if you look at two other past bridge projects as examples of this. So on the one hand, you had this bridge called the Sunshine Sky Bridge, which had to have repairs done to it. And that project did not qualify or was not granted an exclusion. And so the repairs for the Sunshine Sky Bridge took 5 years to complete. Now, 5 years sounds like a long time, and it's certainly not a short time. It's also not an unusually long amount of time. 5 years for the Sunshine Sky Bridge repairs. Contrast that to the I-35 St. Anthony Falls Bridge over the Mississippi River. When they were building that, they did have a categorical exclusion on that, and that took 11 months. So 5 years versus 11 months. Sounds like a big, big difference to me. All right, so after all this wrangling about who's supporting what, how long it's going to take, is there any word on when it's actually going to be finished by and how much is it going to cost? Now, as of May the 2nd, so earlier in May, Maryland DOT officials came out and said that, unless something unforeseen happened, which is always the case in situations like this, they said they're thinking that this bridge, the replacement bridge, is going to be finished by the fall of 2028. So that is about 4.5 years. And it's going to cost, they say, between 1.7 and 1.9 billion dollars. It's a whole heck of a lot more than 350 million, but we already knew that. So now we come to the discussions about who's going to pay for what. We talked about the discussions of the insurance that's going to come into this and the effects on the supply chain, all that kind of stuff. But now we have to talk about the legal wrangling over who's going to pay for what. And that's the part that is, when you start looking at the details of this, it might leave a bad taste in the mouths of a lot of people, because some of the people that are most directly involved in the accident pretty quickly started making legal filings to try and limit how much liability they had. Less than a week after the accident, April the 1st, remember, March 26th is the accident. By April the 1st, two companies, Grace Ocean Private and Synergy Marine Group, they were involved in the operation of the ship. They filed a petition in Maryland District Court, and what they were aiming to do is they were citing what many people call this obscure maritime law that was passed back in 1851 in order to limit their financial liability in the whole thing to a little over $40 million. Remember, the bridge that their ship knocked down is going to cost $1.7 to $1.9 billion to build a new one, which means if those marine operators are only actually on the hook for $40 million, that's going to leave a bill of, well, let me see, carry the 1, divide by X, 1.6, between 1.66 and $1.86 billion for the taxpayers to foot. Now, how are they able to get away with this? Well, to be fair, they haven't gotten away with it yet. This is a filing that they did. So we'll see how that gets resolved. But this law that we're talking about is the Limitation of Liability Act of 1851. And what it states is the owner of a marine vessel may limit damage claims to the value of the vessel at the end of the voyage, plus this thing that they call pending freight, as long as the owner can prove that the owner, lacked knowledge of whatever problem impacted the ship beforehand. Now, that law was passed way back in 1851 as a measure to protect the U.S. shipping industry at the time, because at that time, ship owners were subject to losses from events beyond their control, like, storms and pirates. Think of everything that would have gone on in the middle of the 19th century, right? So that act, the Limitation of Liability Act, was passed in order to limit their liability to the value of the vessel. And the thinking was that if they didn't have that, then American shipping was going to be at a competitive disadvantage, because in other maritime countries, they did have similar limitations. And so we were trying to make our shipping competitive with British shipping or Spanish shipping or whoever else was doing it at that time. So that's what they're trying to do. Now, like I said, this case isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. Legal analysts think it's going to take a decade, maybe more. And in the meantime, nobody's waiting around for that case to decide if Grace Ocean is going to be paying for this. So they got to get on with the business of rebuilding things regardless of what happens in that case. But still, with everything that happened in that situation, it does seem maybe a little bit unfair that the owners and the operators of the ship are trying to so severely limit how much financial responsibility that they have in all of this. And then, if that wasn't enough, Grace Ocean then made another legal filing. They declared what's called a general average declaration. And what a general average declaration says is it basically forces the people who own the cargo that the ship was transporting, it forces them to pay for part of the salvage cost. Okay, let's explain. Okay, so there's a principle of maritime law called the law of general average, whereby all the stakeholders in a sea venture, and by sea venture, you got a ship, and a bunch of people have contracted with the operators of the ship to transport a whole bunch of different kinds of cargo to another destination. That is what they call a sea venture, right? So the law general average really shares losses resulting from a voluntary sacrifice on the part of the ship or cargo to save the whole in an emergency. Okay, let's use an example. Let's say that you have a ship that is carrying a bunch of cargo. So it is a sea venture, and you've got a bunch of stakeholders. Stakeholders being people who paid for cargo to go on that. Maybe there's people who are riding on the ship, passengers, people who own the ship. They're all stakeholders in this. And let's say something happens and the ship is going to sink, right? And so they have to jettison a bunch of cargo in order to lighten the ship in a storm so the ship doesn't sink, so that they can save the whole. Somebody's got to pay for the value of that cargo. And so under this law of general average, that loss would actually be shared pro rata by both the carrier and also all the other cargo owners that were involved in the venture. Now, that's what Grace Ocean is claiming. They're claiming that everybody who paid to have cargo on the ship, they all have to share in the costs of the salvage for that. Now, I, believe it or not, am not an expert in maritime law here. And there are people way above my pay grade who ultimately will make determinations on how all that's going to be resolved. But from the facts of the situation that we know thus far, it just doesn't seem like there was any voluntary sacrifice of the ship or cargo involved here. Yet that is what Grace Ocean is arguing in this filing. Now, make no mistake, they can make these legal filings all they want, but they still have a whole heap of legal trouble ahead of them, because you also got the Baltimore City Council filing suit. You've also got a class action consortium of businesses affected by the port closing who have filed legal actions against Grace Ocean. And their legal actions allege that the ship was unseaworthy. And that brings us to the last significant part of what we're going to talk about today, which is the investigation into not only what exactly happened, but hopefully why it happened. So, as you'd expect with a situation of this magnitude, the investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, began almost immediately. They were on site pretty quickly. And the initial schedule was they said, we're going to have a preliminary report out in 2 to 4 weeks. And meanwhile, the full investigation is going to keep going. And that's going to take anywhere from 12 to 24 months, which is par for the course in this kind of thing. Now, you may remember in the first podcast episode that we did when we first talked about this, that one of the first things that the investigators did was they retrieved and started to analyze the Voyage Data Recorder, or VDR. The VDR is analogous to the black box on airplanes. It's basically the black box for the ship. And so they retrieved it. It wasn't hard to retrieve because the ship hadn't sunk. We have to remember that. The ship is still just sitting there, right? So they go on board, they get the VDR, and they start looking at the data on it, and that helps them develop a timeline of events that led up to the accident. What's known to this point about the sequence of events? At some point when it was on its way, but not yet out of the harbor, and certainly not cleared of the bridge, at some point the ship lost power to its critical propulsion system, and that is what caused it to crash into the bridge. I know, genius, right? What the NTSB is trying to do now is they're trying to figure out why that power was lost. Now, one of the initial hypotheses that was floated out there, no pun intended, was contaminated fuel. Either fuel being contaminated that caused then power to be lost and the propulsion system to shut down, or maybe even the wrong grade of fuel was used. So that's one set of hypotheses. There was another hypothesis that concerns the ship's electrical system. In order to really dig into that, that requires them examining the circuit breaker system of the ship, which means they're having to have some pretty in-depth technical dialogues with the shipbuilder, which is Hyundai Heavy Industries. Now, we have been hearing news starting to come out that the ship had both mechanical and electrical system problems before it had even left port. That would imply that the ship left the crew on the ship, the crew of the ship left the port aware of these problems. And because that started to come out, that meant that the investigation started shifting to a criminal investigation. So now the FBI comes in. So now you got the FBI involved as well as the NTSB. Now, remember too, you've got 6 people that perished in the accident. So because there was human death involved, now you've got the ship's officers, the owners, and the charterers of the ship could be facing potential criminal liability, potential criminal prison sentences of 10 years, possibly, because they might have violated what's called the seaman's manslaughter statute. Now, in case you didn't know the difference between seaman's manslaughter and regular person's manslaughter, and we know you don't, under common law manslaughter, i.e., something that doesn't involve a ship, under common law manslaughter, in order for that charge to stick, so to speak, there has to be what's called mens rea, a mental state of gross negligence, or what they call heat of passion in absence of malice. Basically, you can't accidentally walk into a manslaughter situation. They have to prove that you have a mental state of gross negligence in order for you to be guilty of that. Regular person manslaughter. The seaman's manslaughter statute is different. It actually lowers the bar on that to only simple negligence, which could be something like a breach of duty to perform an act or an omission of the violation of a standard of care. And by you being negligent and not doing something that you normally were supposed to do, that caused the death of somebody else on that ship. That would be seaman's manslaughter. And so the threshold of criminal liability is lower in seaman's manslaughter than it is in standard manslaughter cases because of that reduced mens rea requirement. And so this is one of the things the FBI is looking for when they boarded the ship, is evidence that would point to those kind of negligent violations. Now, to this point in time, they have not yet said the results of that. So they're still working on that. All right, so now let's get to what we've been building up to all this time, which is the things that are in that preliminary report. So on May 14th, about 6 weeks or so after the accident, the NTSB releases that preliminary report, and this is what they found that they put into the report. So the ship, the MV Dolly, had originally arrived in the U.S. from Sri Lanka, which is where it was supposed to be going back to. It went from Sri Lanka to the U.S., visited a few other U.S. ports with the intention to arrive in Baltimore as its final port of destination on March 23rd, which is what happened. So it arrives in Baltimore, March 23rd, and it's getting loaded up with cargo. Because remember, it's supposed to leave again to go back to Sri Lanka on March 26th. Now, the preliminary NTSB report states that the day before the accident, or the day before it was supposed to leave, which is March 25th, the Dolly ship experienced 2 in-port blackouts. And those 2 blackouts were such that it prompted the crew to make some changes to the main electrical bus configuration on the ship's electrical system. And this new amended configuration is what the ship was using when it left port. Now, these 2 blackouts while the ship was in port, they were able to figure out they were caused by 2 different things. The first blackout was caused by what they call a mechanical blocking of the online generator's exhaust gas tank. They had a crew member was working on the ship's scrubber system. The scrubber system is something that the ship has to help clean the exhaust of the ship so that all the unburned carbon and sulfur and stuff are not going out into the air. And one of the crew members was working on that. And they had mistakenly actually closed the damper, okay? And by them closing the damper, that tripped the ship's breaker and it shut the electrical system down. Okay, the crew figured this out and they manually restored power. And then what they did was they switched the bus configuration to use different breakers and different transformers. That's what happened with outage number 1. The second outage occurred when they had insufficient fuel pressure, which caused the ship's backup generator then shut off, which again led the crew to modify for a second time the ship's electrical configuration. And this time they switched from a transformer breaker system that had been used for at least several months on the ship. They switched to a different system, and that's what they were planning to use on the accident voyage. What the NTSB was thinking was the primary electrical breaker on the ship was tripped after the ship was en route. Remember, power got cut off while the ship was on its way. That kind of thing just doesn't just happen. Something tripped it. Something tripped that breaker. And the breaker that tripped, it fades most of the ship's electrical equipment and the ship's lighting. And very importantly, it powers the pumps, the propulsion pumps, which meant that the main propulsion engines then shut down when that was tripped. And then, even better, and perhaps even more saliently to the situation, is the 3 steering pumps that they had, those also shut down when that breaker was tripped. That meant that after that power was lost, after the breakers were tripped, this ship that's, I don't know how many tens of thousands of tons, just traveling at 9 knots in the water, has no steering and has no propulsion. They are dead in the water, a giant moving weight. So that's what the NTSB thinks was kind of the primary cause of this. The full investigation, of course, is still ongoing, and they're not going to have the full report for maybe another year or more. If they can find out what tripped that main breaker, then they probably will have a better candidate for who is the primary blame for this situation. Now, the last takeaway for us on this is the preliminary report also stated that they did fuel testing and they found no evidence of fuel contamination. What they did, they know that the ship, the MV Dolly, switched to a different kind of fuel called low sulfur marine gas oil. Now, that's not unusual. This isn't some weird fuel that makes somebody say, hey, if they hadn't switched to that, the disaster wouldn't happen. The fact that they switched to this is neither here nor there. The Dolly switched to this different kind of fuel 5 days before the accident. So what they did was they took fuel samples. They took fuel samples from the marine gas oil that was still on the ship, and they also took fuel samples from all the fuel tanks that the ship had pulled from. They tested all of those, and their testing found that all those fuel samples indeed were in compliance with all the applicable international standards and regulations. Means the fuel was fine. And that means fuel quality gets to be ruled out as a contributing factor to that accident. So the times where we've said, well, they think it might be contaminated fuel, they've at least been able to rule that out. And so that's good. So now we just continue to play the wait and see game to see if they can come up with a better answer on what caused this accident. And so that, my friends, is our latest up-to-date summary on the MV Dolly's collision with the Francis Scott Key Bridge accident. As we get additional information, we will keep you updated. But that's going to wrap it up for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. As always, we will have show notes to some of the things or links in the show notes to some of the things that we talked about today. If you haven't done already, we would really encourage you to subscribe. Tell your friends to subscribe to the podcast at whatever podcast purveyor of choice you happen to like. And while you're at it, leave us a review, because those kind of reviews really do help us a lot. So until next time, I'm Erik Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. I will see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.